Hello and welcome here again live to the World Crypto Network to the next show of Read Rothbard and Use Bitcoin. As you see, I'm back from Leipzig from the Hayek Summer Seminar. I'm back in my hometown. Unfortunately, I did not get to sleep in this amazing hammock. Unfortunately, I had a 13-hour delay with the state-run and operated train company. So surprise, surprise. But regardless, I'm joined here by the great Stephan Livera from the, of course, Stephan Livera podcast. Stephan, how are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on, Max. I've watched a lot of World Crypto Net over the last year or two, so it's a pleasure to finally be on.
Oh, that is fantastic. Well, it's always nice to intermingle the podcasts, right? And to connect this network of content creators because there is a bunch of high quality content out there. And I encourage all of you to go out and check out the Stephan Livera podcast. He has amazing interviews with top-notch people. And he's talking about Bitcoin, liberty, Austrian economics. What else would you want to talk about, right?
That's it.
So where can the people find that podcast, Stephan?
Yep. So, guys, you can find my podcast on your podcast app if you go to iTunes or Stitcher or any of the podcast apps. And if you just search Stephan Livera podcast. And otherwise, you can find my website, stephanlivera.com. And you can also find me on Twitter. And my handle is @StephanLivera.
Quite good when everything is with the same name, right? Quite easy to remember. So, guys, links in the description, of course, right? So, and today we're going to start off reading with one fantastic little essay called Deflation and Liberty by Jörg Guido Hülsmann, which, by the way, he was here on the World Crypto Network a couple months ago. So that was a fantastic brief interview, and he will be coming back in just a few weeks. So that is fantastic. This essay that we're reading is, of course, available for free at the Mises Institute on Mises.org. So we're going to read the last paragraph of the introduction. The present essay argues that this is a half-truth. It is true that without further government intervention, there would be a deflationary spiral. It is not true that this spiral would be bottomless and wipe out the economy. It would not be a moral threat to the lives and the welfare of the general population. It destroys essentially those companies and industries that live a parasitical existence at the expense of the rest of the economy and which owe their existence to our present fiat money system. Even in the short run, therefore, deflation reduces our real income only within rather narrow limits, and it will clear the ground for very substantial growth rates in the medium and long run. We should not be afraid of deflation. We should love it as much as our liberties. That is one fantastic quote to start it off with. So, Stephan, what do you say about this essay in general and specifically this article right here?
Yeah, this is a fantastic essay. I read it years ago, and in reading it, it helped inform my understanding of economics and of money. And I think at the time that this essay came out, there was a little bit of maybe not a disagreement, but a slight different understanding within the Austrian economics school. There were many who sort of agreed that, yes, deflation is bad. And in this essay, I think Guido really took a slightly different interpretation and did it in a convincing way that helped people understand why, in this sense, actually deflation can be a good thing also, because in a sense, it's helping wipe or wash away some of the malinvestments that had been caused in the past because of the fiat credit expansion, as you know, Max. Now, one of the other really interesting essays that I think, I would recommend if you're interested in Austrian economics. Another one that's really good to look up, I forgot the exact name, but it's something like A Taxonomy of Deflation by Joseph Salerno.
Exactly, Taxonomy of Deflation.
Yeah, and this is a fantastic essay as well. I assume you've read it also, Max?
Yes, I have. And here, Joseph Salerno is, of course, a fantastic economist. And here in this article, he clearly describes on what inflation is and why it is so such an interesting economic phenomena and why it is often misunderstood. So maybe Stephan, to first get us started here, before we talk about deflation, let's touch a little bit about inflation first. And
Sure.
So how would you define inflation in general?
Well, this is the classic dispute. So if you're an Austrian, you think inflation think of it as money supply inflation. So that relates to an increase of the money supply. Now, if you speak in terms of the kind of normie finance, they think of inflation in terms of the CPI, the consumer price index. The price of things is going up. So there's there's an importance just to understand. Now, I don't think you can go out and win the battle and tell them all, no, you should change your use of the word. It's just, you should be clear what we're speaking of when we speak about it. So normally people use the term price deflation or money supply deflation to try and help articulate exactly what it is they mean.
Exactly, and it's not just the difference of these words in general, but also they are specific for different monetary systems. So, for example, in a gold monetary system, a inflation is literally pulling gold out of the ground, right, and then having raw gold in your hand. But then, further, there's a difference between having raw gold and having minted gold coins. So, producing additional gold coins will then inflate the money supply of gold. So there's, also some differences here. And then, of course, with the fiat money system, especially a debt-based fiat money system as we have it today, the monetary base is created on several or increased on several different layers, including but not limited to, for example, fractional reserve, and of course, credit issuance and credit creation. But now that we've established inflation, that it is based on the monetary supply, what then is deflation, Stephan?
Yeah, so that is where I think we can understand, depending on how we understand it. And I think the key one that most people are scared of in terms of the bad deflation, what they're really thinking of there is the credit deflation. Right. So I think if you sort of if I were to summarize kind of the key points that you should take away from that Joseph Salerno taxonomy on deflation, I would say there's two key ones. It's distinguished between what is the good deflation and what is the bad deflation, so to speak. Right. And so the good deflation is what he calls growth deflation. And that's the good one that we like to see. We like to, obviously, computers are getting cheaper every year. You can buy, the computer that you can buy for $1,000 today is much, much better than what you could buy for $1,000 5 years ago or even 1 year ago. So that's the good growth deflation that we all like. And every consumer should be in favor of that. So I think most people would agree with that. Obviously, there are some who might disagree for various other technical reasons. We can maybe get into that later. But obviously the bad deflation, quote unquote, is the bank credit deflation. And that is really that's really the credit collapse scenario, right? And so when Joseph Salerno was writing that essay or that article, I think he was writing that in, say, the mid-90s or so. And then understand the timeline, when Guido Hülsmann came out with the Deflation and Liberty article, off the top of my head, I think it was around 2008. I can't remember the exact
I think it was 2000. It was 2008 when he published the Deflation and Liberty, but he wrote it earlier, but he postponed it because he wanted to finish the Ethics of Money Production, which is, of course, magnum opus in monetary theory.
Yes, yeah, and that's a fantastic book. That's one of my favorite books. But yeah, so I think at the time that Guido brought that essay, Deflation and Liberty, that sort of helped inform the understanding amongst the Austrians that even that what we call bad deflation, in a sense, is a kind of good deflation, because it's good to the extent that it is liquidating out the prior malinvestments that have occurred over time. And I suppose,
Exactly.
yeah, go on.
Exactly, because the money supply in the fiat system is increased as more debt is being taken on, right? As more deposits are being made and more fractional reserve credit is being issued. And of course, because this money is such cheap for the banks to get, they do not have to wonder that much on how they're going to invest it. They do not have to allocate it to really high profitable and secure investments, but rather they will have to look for investments that are much more riskier in order but maybe even still have lower returns. And therefore, all these investments that have been made with inflated fractional reserve fiat money are bad investments, after all. And sooner or later, they will have to decline. And especially when those banks, or sorry, when those companies default that have gotten these credits, a default is a decrease in the money supply. And that means that there is further pressure, not just by the defaulting, but also by a decrease in the money supply on the fractional reserve banks, because they will have to use their own funds in order to reimburse all these depositors that will now no longer have the money that the bank has given to the now default bank company. So not only does the company go bust, but maybe also the bank, because it does not have enough liquidity to reimburse all the depositors.
Yeah, yeah. And that's then where the whole thesis around the lender of last resort comes in. So that's where in practice and in history, banks were not stable in a fractional reserve banking environment. And as such, the bankers would argue and try and argue that case that, oh, we need a central bank, we need a lender of last resort. And that is sort of that's the story of history, And so that's, for me, I got that from reading Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles by Jesus Huerta de Soto. And in that's another, again, a huge book. It's, it's a very long read, but it really helps articulate some of the key reasons why fractional reserve banking, and particularly fiat credit expansion, which relates to the creation of what is called fiduciary media. So that is the creation of money that is unbacked by voluntary saving. And so the entire, the whole case rests on that.
Yes, and the involuntary part is really important, because even in a free society, I am of the belief that there could be a fractional reserve deposit scheme, but it would have to be clear and it would have to be open, that the money that you deposit in this bank is no longer your money, or, well, you do have claims on that money, but it is no longer available for you and it is no longer liquid for you. It is given away to someone else, right? But a true store of your money, where you have a claim, an instant claim, that is just not what a fractional reserve is by definition, because there is more claims out there on that money than money proper in the safe. Or Stephan, do you think that we could have a fractional reserve in a free society, or is it just inherently unjust?
So, okay, so there's a few different points to understand here. Actually, a really good one, if you, for the listeners, look up the recent debate between Bob Murphy and George Selgin. That was at the Soho Forum. And so they go through a lot of the key arguments on that in this particular, on this particular debate. Now, in that particular debate, Bob was taking the side of the full reserve side, and George Selgin was taking the fractional reserve side. Now, understand that these guys are both very free market, right? It's not that one of them wants government and the other doesn't. They were both, it's just that they are kind of, in a sense, differing on what they believe the outcome of that would be. So they are basically disagreeing in terms of what reserve ratio would banks settle at in a truly free market, and what would cause greater monetary or just greater banking instability. So George Selgin's argument is basically that banks they might settle at a reserve ratio of like 3 or 4%, right, instead of 100%. And Bob Murphy's argument, and that's the side of the full reserve banking side. So that's people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, Guido Hulsmann, Joseph Salerno, Bob Murphy. and others, and Walter Block as well, I think. Anyway, they argue that that reserve ratio would be much closer to 100% in a truly free market. Now, there's a few different points to disentangle there. One point is the is it fraud argument, and the other point is the disregarding the fraud argument, does it cause greater monetary, instability? So the argument that Bob was trying to make is that actually, even if I disregard the whole fraud argument, even if I concede that to you, George Selgin, I concede that to you, he was basically saying, even still, there would be monetary instability. And the reason for that is coming back to the Austrian theory of, the business cycle. And so he's saying the theory of the business cycle is not just the central banks are creating all this money. He's saying actually it's the expansion or the creation of fiduciary media. So it's actually the commercial banks when they expand out that credit. And there's a few other crucial points that come into it, right? Crucially, it's important that everyone out in the community regards those claims, those paper tickets to money, as being real money. And they treat it like they can spend it whenever they want, not, oh, that's in a term deposit. I do not have access to that for 6 months, which is the term of my term deposit. You understand that? So that is one of the points he's trying to make. And so he's actually saying, even regardless of the fraud point, it would still cause monetary, instability. Reason being, there are more paper claims circulating out in the community than there are kind of physical gold bars to back that up in the older example, right? And so now if you combine that insight with also what Guido Hulsmann's book, The Ethics of Money Production, he talks about certain key interventions that occurred over time that made the citizens, or just the taxpayers and the people in that society, treat the paper claims as though they were as good as a real claim, as a real Bitcoin or a real gold. Yeah. And so through legal tender laws, the government was able to sort of create this artificial society and make people stay with that money, right? So in this example, it would be like forcing you to keep a paper ticket and value it and price it as the same as a real piece of gold. Now, in our example, where we're talking about Bitcoin, that would be, would you value a fractional reserve Bitcoin the same as you would a full reserve Bitcoin, right? And it's not that any government is going to come out and mandate, oh yes, Max, you must treat your fractional reserve, this fractional reserve Bitcoin that Stephan is trying to give you, you must treat that the same as a full reserve. Well, no, right? You would obviously go, hang on, nah, mate, I'm not gonna treat a fractional reserve Bitcoin the same as a full reserve Bitcoin. So in my view, I think we're more likely to see what is a full reserve banking world. Now, note there's a difference here. It doesn't mean we're not going to see credit at all. There will be credit, but it will be credit backed by saving. And in a sense, think of it as you must be foregoing access to that money for it to be kind of voluntary saving, right? So in that book, Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles, Huerta de Soto goes through this point, and he sort of spells out the difference between kind of what's called the demand deposit, or the at call, the money that you can claim right away and it's accessible to you, or I put this money away in a term deposit with the bank and I cannot access it for 6 months. Yeah. So what he's trying to say and what he's trying to help explain, and I think Bob Murphy does a similar explanation, is that the only legitimate kind of credit is that one there where you've put it away and you do not have access to it, or you've agreed with the bank, hey bank, I don't have access to this for 6 months, because you are taking that money and you are then, obviously, banks play that role of intermediating. They're a financial intermediator, right? They take in money from depositors and they lend it out to borrowers. That is their role. But that role is only in relation to the term deposit side, let's say. The other role that they play is more like a warehousing role. So does that make sense to you, Max?
Oh yes, absolutely. That are fantastic points that you bring up here, and it's important to differentiate between a voluntary market and a coercive market, right? Because I do think that we have seen a fractional reserve in Bitcoin already, with of course exchanges, right? Mt. Gox was running on fractional reserve. They were issuing claims on Bitcoin that were exceeding their reserves of actual Bitcoin that they were hodling the private keys on. And although that there was no legal tender here, so nobody was forcing the citizen or the users, the Bitcoin users, to accept these claims on Bitcoin as Bitcoin proper. Nevertheless, because Mt. Gox did not publicly claim that they were running a fractional reserve scheme, right? They were trying to hide it, and that means that this is fraudulent because people treated these claims to Bitcoin as full reserve Bitcoin. And of course, turns out, well, no, it was not. They actually had a huge deficit. And with the Willy bot, right, they were trying to decrease that deficit, but it didn't really work out that well. And of course, what we saw then was kind of a bank run, right? People wanted to get their Bitcoin out of Mt. Gox, but then it collapsed. So how would you see Mt. Gox in this situation?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, another point, and it's a good point you raised there, Max. So another point that I learned from reading Huerta de Soto's Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles is the point around bank runs, right? So I think people have this conception that, oh, in a full reserve world, there would never ever be bank runs. I think it's more like bank runs are like a free market check or a control to stop fractional reserve. So I would say, so I think part of the argument, I can't remember the exact chapter, it's sort of towards the end of the book, but essentially he's pointing out that these are, in a sense, that's almost a way that people really, they have, it's like a deterrent effect. So banks have to kind of live in the fear that their customers will go and do a bank run on them if they're not maintaining full reserves. So I hypothesize, and my interpretation from reading the Austrian economics books on this is that there would still be failures within a fully free market society. There might be a bank who tries it out every now and then, but the important thing is that they be allowed to fail when that happens, rather than having a central bank that's there to provide them this kind of so-called last-minute liquidity and print up some money and give it to them, or that kind of thing. It's that we need there to be a possibility of failure. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's almost like to me, I think of that kind of like that whole Nassim Taleb kind of thing of you need the system to have that level of anti-fragility, and the way it happens is that it gets periodic. There are periodic shocks and tests of that system, and it's almost like you need people to be careful which bank they put it into. Am I going to put it into bank A or bank B or bank C? Oh, well, I think that Mt. Gox bank looks really dodgy. I'm not going to put my Bitcoins in there. Oh, but this other, Max Bank looks really legitimate, and I think they're going to run a full reserve, legitimate system. Therefore, I'm more comfortable to put my Bitcoins there, even if it was temporary, right? Or, whatever the scenario is. But the point is that there needs to be a risk of some banks failing. And in doing so, that is kind of what helps make the overall system stronger. And, it kind of reminds me of how some of these central banks, they try to provide monetary stability when such a thing cannot exist. So if you've read Mises and you've read all the other Austrians, they argue that there is no such thing as monetary stability. It is a flaw. It's a fallacy. And so when the government and the central banks act to intervene into the market and to try to provide some level of stability, I think it's kind of like that very Talebian idea that, you might take away some of the smaller shocks, but you're massively increasing the risk of taking a big shock, right? And so that's also something that came to me just from, reading and watching some of these videos in terms of things like another example would be Tom Woods' speech, Economic Cycles Before the Fed. And right, so some people have spoken about the problems that have existed, right? So they'll say, oh, well, hang on, but we still had monetary crashes and instability before the creation of the Federal Reserve? And the Austrian answer on that is, well, actually, the answer is go back and look. And if you look and if you read, you'll see the answer was always there was credit expansion. There was fiduciary media being created. And that is what led to the unsustainable boom, which, as we know, results in a bust eventually.
Oh,
now,
yes.
Where some Austrians get tripped up is that they try to call it. They try and say, I think it'll happen now, right? And then Austrians get kind of lumped in with that, with the whole, oh, you're a perma bear. You think it's always going to fail. You've called 25 of the last 2 recessions, right? So that is the difficulty in trying to articulate this. But I think the reality is that sometimes unsustainable things can go on longer than you think they can. And, as an example, communism took, like 5 or 6 decades to fall, right? Now, for a long, long time, a lot of the free market economists were saying, no, I'm a bit sus. I don't think the numbers coming out of, Soviet Russia are legit, right? I don't think they're saying these crazy good production numbers, and they were lying, right? But the lie was only revealed at the very end. So in a likewise sense, in our current modern day monetary world, the way I think of it is, we're kind of living in this huge global bubble, and we don't know when it will end. We don't know what will cause it to end, and we also don't know in terms of the responses by the coming responses by a government, right? Because what may happen is, as a housing bubble starts to pop, well, then the government might try and juice it again and lower the interest rates. So these are just examples of all the monetary intervention that's happening in our modern day world. And while Austrian economics can give us some ability to analyze and understand what's going on, it's not a perfect science. It's really just you can have a understanding of whether society is accumulating capital and growing, or whether it is consuming capital and there is malinvestment going on. So that's how I think of it, Max.
Yeah, fantastic points that you bring up. And I want to pull up here a picture that was on the Twitter of Mustap Murad, who was also here on the World Crypto Network. And we've talked about this for a long time. Actually, that's the wrong picture that I wanted to show. Let me pull it up. Because there is further here a picture of the money supply with all these different currencies. And as you will see in just a second here, is that we see, for example, up here, the US dollar monetary base, right? It's quite volatile. You also see the Ethereum monetary base, which is also quite volatile. And then you have Bitcoin, which not only is it predictable, right? That is nice or stable. I mean, not that volatile as this is right here. But I think the most interesting part in this graph is that it does not stop at the present moment. With Bitcoin, we know, we can prove that the money supply will actually, or how it will continue to grow in the future. So Stephan, how do you think that regardless if the money supply in Bitcoin will be inflationary or deflationary, how do you think that the aspect that we can prove the money supply, not just today, but in the future, affects this entire theory?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point, Max. And I think what you're really getting at there is predictability. So the more predictable the money supply is, the more people can place their faith into it as a store of value. So as Bitcoin right now, so I mean, we all refer to it as deflationary, but I suppose if we were going to nitpick, it's disinflationary, right? So that means it will continue to inflate, but every 4 years it will halve. And so basically, if you calculate that out, that basically means year on year, every year, Bitcoin's inflation rate is dropping, right? And so the effect is obviously every 4 years it's halving, but the point there then is that we have better certainty and therefore a better ability to store our value through time and space, which was basically the original conception, Carl Menger, on the origins of money, right? Now, the other thing there is, yes, now there's a few nitpicks, right? Some people could nitpick us, but we should just explain what's going on there. So it's not that we will have atomic precision on the money supply as it goes forward and, you know, back and forth. There are other reasons it may differ slightly. One of them is the Bitcoin miners, when they finish their mining and they get the block reward, they have an option. Like, obviously they choose to take normally they would take the maximum, but there have been a few instances in Bitcoin's history where they didn't take the full allotment, let's say. So this permanently reduced the eventual supply of Bitcoin. And the other factor that happens, obviously, is difficulty adjustment. And what's happening is, as there are so many new miners hitting the network, Bitcoin's supply has actually expanded slightly faster than what the algorithm would have suggested, right? And that may also, you know, play into it in the future as well, that, you know, maybe in like, you know, 2060 or whatever, the amount of variance in terms of like, if way more miners hit the network that year, then maybe it'll sort of actually increase the inflation rate a little bit more than what it, you know, quote unquote, should have been. So it's not an exact science, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. However, yeah, go on.
Well, just to jump in for what you're saying right here, I agree that we do not know the inflation rate based in like human time, like the 60 minutes, 24 hours a day time, 7 days a week time. But we do know the inflation in block time, right? And there the increase in hashing power, you know, is not affected. Yes, we find more blocks sooner, but the amount of blocks and the Bitcoin that has been created up to this number of block stays the same.
True, but we live in human time, right? So,
yes,
well, I don't know. Unless eventually our block will be, it's block, you know, whatever 200,000, whatever the block number is, right? But yeah, look, these are kind of small little things, right? It's like when you say, the maximum supply is 21 million, say, no, it's actually like 20,999,000, blah blah blah, whatever, right? Yeah, but on the whole, we know it's just miles and miles ahead of anything else. And this is the point that I think Saif Dinamous really nailed home in his book, The Bitcoin Standard. So
must
I think
read by everyone. Must read.
Yeah, fantastic book. And you know, I think there's many things that he really explains well in this book. But I think in terms of Austrian economics, I think one of the good things that he has really helped popularize is this concept of stock to flow. And in doing so, I think he really places a focus on hard money and how does hard money compete, right? And how can a money compete with other money? Well, it does it by being more hard, so to speak. It does it by being less inflationary. So that is that's the main point to understand on that.
Exactly, and so maybe let's get more into the specific inflation rate in Bitcoin, the stock to flow ratio, because of course as we see in this chart here, it has been really high in the early days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost it was infinite in the first block, right, from 0 to 1, and that is an infinite inflation rate. The second block, we already had 50 Bitcoin in existence, plus the additional next Bitcoin. That's 100% inflation rate. So in the early days, Bitcoin was highly inflationary. So do you think that there's an issue with the initial high inflation rate in Bitcoin, or do you think that because we have this long-term stability and we know that the inflation rate will later drop, that even the early entrepreneurs could discount this high inflation rate?
Right. Okay. So a few things to think about here. Remember, in those early days, in 2009, when the Genesis block was mined, nobody cared about Bitcoin except for Satoshi, Hal Finney, and maybe a few other people, right? There were very few people working on it. It just wasn't, I would say it was a non-issue. It was just a non-factor. Now, obviously, you get some people now, and they tend to be the leftists, right? They tend to be a little more socialist in nature, and they tend to say, that's so unfair. Why didn't you but then the problem is, what would be a fair way to distribute the new Bitcoin? That, ultimately, as soon as you introduce any kind of, coordinating party to try, and you think about all the identity and the privacy, and how would you pick how much to give to each person. It's just not going to work that way. And the other point, I think one of my podcast guests mentioned this. I think VJ actually mentioned this idea that if you're just given something for free, you don't really value it. It's only when you really have to buy it and you work for it, then you really value that. So that's another factor to consider there. And then I suppose now let's bring it back to your point where you were saying, entrepreneurs in the Bitcoin space, could they discount the future inflation rate? Well, I guess the short answer would be yeah, because if you look at the monetary chart and so on, although obviously back in those days it probably didn't have the same rigor applied to it in terms of like analysis, right? You hadn't had those guys like some of the earlier Austrian guys who showed up to the space and helped explain and understand these things. So guys like Pierre Rochard, Michael Goldstein, Conrad Graf, Peter Serter, some of those guys who were around in those earlier in the earlier days. Like I know guys like Peter Serter and Conrad aren't as around now, whereas guys like Pierre and Michael Goldstein definitely are around. And yeah, so for example, that famous chart that I think Pierre has done, which shows the monetary policy, I think those things weren't as understood then, because back then it was just, hey, how do we make some kind of online way to transfer value? There wasn't really much of a thought given. And fair enough, right? There wasn't as much of a thought given to long-term store of value or all of those other kind of things that, what I think some of the top guys have brought in since.
Exactly. Yes. And it's a question of bootstrapping, right? Because Bitcoin initially, as you said, nobody cared about. There wasn't much value there. However, in order for it to be useful, it had to be secure. And in order to be secure, there had to be people mining it. And nobody was using it, so nobody valued it, so nobody was willing to pay for that security. How else can you pay for security then, other with inflation? So all this inflation was used to roughly for the first maybe 12 years, to subsidize the mining power, to subsidize the security of the network in order so that the currency could bootstrap. And I would argue that we are slowly reaching that point, and thankfully so, now that the subsidy is declining, that there is enough value in Bitcoin, that enough people are using it to store their value, that they are willing to pay for the security. And that's why I do think that now that the inflation rate is going to be really, really low for the next 100 years, for the next infinity, right? Bitcoin is not going to stop. That now people will be able to pay for the security directly with the transaction fees.
Yes, so that's an interesting question. And Rusty Russell wrote a really good article called The 3 Economic Eras of Bitcoin. And in that article, he talks about some of the different, I think one of them he talks about Satoshi's subsidy, right? And so I think he's basically predicting towards 2030 or so, most of the block reward, the inflation in Bitcoin will have taken place. Obviously, all the inflation will take place by 2140, so over 100 years from now. But by even 2030, most of the supply will have been released. And at that point, basically, that will be a very sink or swim moment for Bitcoin, because then the transaction fees will have to account for the level of security. Now, I'm optimistic, but we can't, we don't know. So the high level thoughts I would give on this, first of all, think about it like this. Halving every 4 years, then so long as the price is doubling every 2 years, then that kind of helps keep the Bitcoin block reward in equilibrium from a fiat point of view. So we don't necessarily need hyper Bitcoinization by 2030. But what we do need is continuing adoption, right? That's very high level. Now, remember, so every 4 years, the price doubles. That's what is required to kind of maintain at least the same level, right? Then the other component is transaction fees. So hopefully once you add that block reward, plus the transaction fees that relate to both on-chain Bitcoin transactions, plus all the the transactions that are associated, obviously on-chain as well, but associated for things like Lightning Network. So that is basically my thought. We need a fee market to develop, and the only way that can happen is if enough people care to basically or you need the utility of transferring value through spending on-chain transactions. The other point is there's multiple moving pieces. There's moving parts here, right? Because remember, the amount of security Bitcoin needs is not static. So the other kind of moving variable is, well, maybe it could be that Bitcoin's mining and Bitcoin's security right now is over provided. So in a sense, it could be that the network will survive using less mining hash power. Now, I think that's unlikely. I think in reality, we're just going to see a continuing ramp up at least until 2030. But it is an interesting point so while the hash power may rise, obviously better technology, better use of, 10 nanometer or 7 nanometer mining chips, so on and so forth. But the cost associated or the amount of energy spent, that can vary. We don't know. Some people have hypothesized that, the stable state will be like over 50% of the world's energy. Now, I don't know. I honestly don't know. It could be 20, 30, who knows? But the question will be, it'll be worth it.
Yes, it will be worth it. I absolutely agree with you on that point. And one thing that I would push back a little bit is the continuous increase of hashing power. And that's something that I talked about with Saifedean as well. And he actually brought that up in your first episode where you talked to him, is that we have this huge subsidy of mining, right? The huge inflationary subsidy. And Austrian economics says, of course, that it doesn't matter what you use this inflationary money for, but in the area that you use it, there will be too much investment that the users or the consumers are not willing to pay for. So I do think that we have seen malinvestments in this sphere and in this mining ecosystem, because there was just too much profitable. They were too profitable in the early days with the subsidized and hidden inflation, so to say. It's not really hidden, but at least with the subsidized inflation. Now the question is, will it come to a crash? And we don't know that, because it might be that without this subsidy, the hashing power would have been even higher, because now that the subsidy is decreasing, but the demand for security is continuously increasing now that the network is becoming even more valuable, that the decrease in subsidy will be nullified with the increase in demand. But I do think that there have been malinvestments, and Bitmain is the perfect example for this. They're a horrible company with a lot of wrong investments.
Yeah, right. So I think on this point, I'm not as, I understand the malinvestment argument. I'm just not sure it applies as much in this particular case in terms of mining. Reason being, think about the world, the overarching world that we live in, the overarching money of the world that we use. It's, US dollar, or in Bitmain, the one, right? Which one had more, money, the Bitcoin's inflation or the fiat money inflation, had a greater impact? On which world were we pricing our supplies in and paying our labor in and buying the land and all these other things? They were priced and driven by the fiat inflation, I would say, more so than the Bitcoin inflation. Though obviously, I would agree with you, once, hypothetically, if the world moved to a Bitcoin standard, then maybe there might be more of an argument there around, kind of the inflation in Bitcoin. And then the other point is also the method of entry, right? So as we talk about, if you just straight up say, okay, hypothetical scenario, you just put a box around this little society, they've got 100 monetary units. And if you just suddenly, double that to 200, well, then in the long run, what we would expect is the prices, everything would just double and it wouldn't really have an impact. But where it would have an impact is if certain people got the money first, and that's Cantillon effects. So I would agree in the sense of miners who maybe miners kind of receive the new money first. But I think that I think the context that we would apply that in is where Bitcoin is the dominant money of the world. Does that make sense?
Yes, and of course, Bitcoin is not the current unit of account yet. But I do think that because miners are inherently a Bitcoin entrepreneurs, right? They are within this ecosystem. And they have a lot of their costs in Bitcoin, right? They do pay for their hardware, at least in Bitcoin. Probably not for the electricity, right? But at least they have all their income in Bitcoin. So those might be entrepreneurs that more earlier adopt Bitcoin as a unit of account, which would then make them more susceptible to this inflation. But that is a great point that you bring up, that Bitcoin is not yet the unit of account, and that therefore this does not really fully apply. And maybe then, as like the last tangent to move on before we stop the show would be, of course, Keynesians value the stable purchasing power, and that is of course their ultimate goal in monetary policy. What we've seen with the US dollar, how not stable the purchasing power is. It has lost 98.5% of its purchasing power in 100 years. So it's not stable in that regard. But their argument still stands. And of course, with Bitcoin now approaching this period of immense, of an incredibly high stock to flow ratio here, or incredibly low inflation rate, there will be no ability to absorb additional demand for the currency to push down the prices, right? So a lot of the new demand will directly lead to higher prices. So do you think that this potential increase in purchasing power and therefore decrease in the purchasing power stability will be beneficial or harmful for Bitcoin?
As in the increase in purchasing power?
Yes, so because more people might use it in the future, its purchasing power will increase. And is this good or bad for economic calculations?
Oh, okay. I think I would answer this by looking, again, sort of step back and look at the base rate, over the long run, over the 10, 20, 30, 40 years out. I think that impact is going to be a much stronger factor in terms of predictability, in terms of businessmen who want to price their contracts for things and say, okay, Max, I'm going to sell you this, and we're going to assume a deflationary rate of 2% or whatever, right? And I think that would be the more dominant factor. But all of this is kind of in the context of Bitcoin standard, a world with predominantly Bitcoin. And we may not get there for another 10, 20 years, who knows? So it's kind of, we're sort of speculating a bit. But I think that, that's kind of how I would think about it in a long run state where Bitcoin is this, is the primary money of the world. It gets more complicated when you start thinking about, the US dollar and how it might what's the transition going to look like?
Okay, yes, that does make sense. And I would further add that yes, the purchasing power is of course important. You need to know how much you can purchase with your monetary goods. But I would see, like, more further in the logical argument would be, what is your overall percentage of total money supply? So let's say Satoshi, he owns 1 million Bitcoin, which is like 5% of the Bitcoin money supply. So for him, regardless of what the purchasing power is, he has the purchasing power of 5% of the entire economy. And this is what he is going to use in his economic calculation. Not too much the fiat terms of that purchasing power.
Yes, that's a fair point. Although with Satoshi, I think that's he's probably gone. Yeah, he's probably gone. He's probably dead, or it's a group, and one or two of them, maybe it's 3 or 4 people, and 1 or 2 of them are dead. Who knows, right? But I think to the broader point you're speaking about, I think that will just be a function of, in the same way that people might design in a CPI term into their long-term business contracts and say, "Oh, I'll buy this from you, and we'll price in maybe 3% CPI every year." people would just, over the long run, they'll figure out, oh, okay, it's deflating at 2% or whatever, 3%, whatever it is, and then just build that into their contracts. So it would just, I think that's the way they would do it. And obviously, like you said, it wouldn't be done in terms of US dollars in a Bitcoin standard world context. It would just be done in terms of purchasing power. Or just literally just going, oh, well, I know the supply of Bitcoin is going to be this, whatever, that much, and I would just calculate that. So I think ultimately it's like that whole rational expectations kind of argument. People would just sort of view the blockchain and understand, okay, what's the block? How many blocks are there now? How many blocks will there be released in 20 years time? What's, the supply going to be? And just figure it out based on that, or roughly, it doesn't have to be an exact science.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. And as you said earlier in the show, that it's a fallacy to think that economic that economic and monetary stability is actually achievable, because we humans are, individuals, and we have individual valuations, and they are changing every single second as our environment is changing and as our adaptation to our environment is changing. So I do not think that a stable monetary unit will decrease the amount of economic calculations that you can do. On the contrary, I would say precisely because it is so stable, and precisely because you know exactly what amount or what percentage of total supply you have, that this will further increase the amount of calculation that we can do.
Exactly. Yeah, I think Bitcoin's predictability of supply makes its purchasing power more predictable than that of other monies, and therefore more suitable for long-term economic planning. I think that would be a very fair statement from an Austrian point of view.
And maybe further as a follow-up. So, what would be able to do better if you have the possibility of doing more precise economic calculations? So, why is this an advantage?
Why is it an advantage? Well, it's because right now businesses have to basically kind of finger in the air and try and take a guess, and they don't know. And so entrepreneurs now are having to deal with the incorrect signals that are being sent by the market. And so in a Bitcoin standard or in a hard money world, they will have greater predictability, and therefore there will be a reduced entrepreneurial error, right? And so that's what malinvestment is. The entrepreneurs have been induced to make these errors because they've been sent the wrong signals. They've been told, oh, look, there's profit in this area. Go and like get capital and put work into that. So that is the way I would think about it.
Yes, that makes sense. And maybe more on the Hayekian answer would be that you can now, with a stable purchase, with a stable money supply, you can more easier differentiate between savings and investments, because ultimately, if people save, this will increase the purchasing power of the entire economy, and therefore entrepreneurs now they're being signaled that they can engage into longer production horizons, right? And they will now invest into like a deeper production stages, and for example, build something that will take 10 years rather than 5 years in order to be done.
Yeah.
And with inflation, the entrepreneurs see that they now have additional capital that they can invest, and they might assume that this comes from savings. But it turns out, no, it does not come from savings. It actually comes from, inflation. And they assume that they can enter into these more longer production stages. But as a matter of fact, the people are not saving. On the contrary, they are consuming. So there's this inherent mismatch, which of course starts with the boom and bust cycle. So Stephan, do you think that there will be a boom and bust cycle in Bitcoin precisely because the inflation rate is near zero?
No. I would say we would not anticipate boom and bust cycles because of Bitcoin. I would anticipate them because of the fiat money side. And coming back to that point I made before about we live in a world where predominantly it's fiat money, right? So it'll be driven by that, not so much by the Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's supply, as we know, it's not that inflationary. And I think the other thing, so it just comes back to that whole predictability point as well, that we know what the money supply will be. Whereas in a fiat money world with credit expansion, you don't necessarily know what the money supply will be. So I think that's kind of how I would sum up on that point.
Yes, that's interesting. Okay. And what we have not yet touched upon is that Bitcoin can be quote unquote destroyed, right? Not in a sense that the UTXO on the blockchain will just vanish, but in a sense that you can lose access control to these Bitcoin. So how does a loss of Bitcoin affect the money supply?
Well, I haven't thought too deeply about that one, but I would say that is like the actual deflation in the Austrian sense. That's the actual like money supply deflation. I think Joe Salerno does mention, like obviously not Bitcoin, but he mentions that scenario around, I think if the central banks were to take money out of the money supply, like intentionally, it could be considered in a similar way to that. So I would have to go do a little bit more reading though to really understand the impacts. But they would likely be negative. But ultimately, it would just be treated like a reduction in the supply. And I think one way, actually, on my podcast when Stephan was a guest, he mentioned this point around how there's about 3 or 4 million Bitcoins that are likely lost. And if you factor that in terms of the current amount of Bitcoins, well, then it's kind of just like the inflation rate is a little bit higher than what we would have initially thought. So that's how Stephan explained that point. So maybe that's one way to think about it as well.
Yes, that does make sense. And I mean, what we do know is the total inflation rate, the total money supply. But what we do not know is who owns it and what are they going to do with it. So it might be that they are just the hodlers of last resorts that will never ever sell their Bitcoin for whatsoever, and their coins might be considered lost in an economic sense. They're still there. They might still be used. So there's still a risk that they might be taken out of deep cold storage and used. But ultimately, entrepreneurs will have to discount these almost lost coins in their economic calculation. Do you think that that there is a metric of which coins are lost and which are not?
So there is an analysis, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it was by this guy named Dhruv Bansal, and he wrote an article called HODL Waves, and he is working at this company called Unchained Capital. And so one of the things that he graphically represented, and it was really clever, is that he tried to graphically represent almost the different waves of sellers. So some people had held, and then after a few years, they had then sold some of their stash. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I don't remember the full details of it. I think it would be best to see his article that he wrote on this. And I think he also did a podcast appearance on Mighty Bent's podcast. So yeah, I would say, go look that one up, and he talks through that one. But I wouldn't know it well enough offhand to be able to explain exactly, what's going on.
Right, but I just love this, that with Bitcoin now, although it is private, right, although it is pseudonymous, for us economists, there is still so many amazing facts that you can find in the Bitcoin blockchain and on the network in general. That is just a lot of interesting things that you can do with all these data. And so how do you think does the open source aspect of Bitcoin, the radical transparency of Bitcoin, help entrepreneurs and economists to calculate?
Well, the funny thing is, as more privacy technology gets implemented into Bitcoin, there'll be less that you can do, right? So it's kind of like right now there's a lot that you can do, but I suspect over time, as more privacy preserving techniques are implemented, such as coin join, Chaumian, the Chaumian joins, all of those different concepts, as they are merged in, if they are merged in, or rather if they are implemented, depending on what they are, then they will reduce the ability of people to do that kind of chain analysis. But rest assured, Max, it'll be for a good reason and we'll all be much richer for it. So you won't be able to analyze as deeply as you can now. Yeah.
Well, that is true. It's just a shame that as Austrians are not really into econometrics, right? We're much more interested in logic and in reason than in trying to find truth in numbers. But nevertheless, right, it is interesting to have all these data available. And I'm quite curious on what future generations will do with that. Because especially, this will not be lost, but it will be here forever. And because the Bitcoin blockchain is a mutable database, we can prove with certainty that these numbers are correct. So we do not know what the Federal Reserve is going to do on Friday, right? But we do know what happened in Bitcoin precisely ever since January 3rd, 2009, and up until infinity. And so that is really a fascinating concept.
Funny story with that, actually. I remember back in the day, I think it might have been back in like 2013 on crypto Twitter with Pierre Rochard, when I had first kind of met him online. I think he did a few troll Twitter posts where he basically said, "Oh, the Bitcoin central bank has met and we've left the monetary policy unchanged." And it was taking a bit of a shot at the Federal Reserve, but I thought that was pretty funny.
That is actually hilarious. And as a matter of fact, the Bitcoin central bankers meet every single day, rather every 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
It's actually these things right here, right? It's a Raspberry Pi connected right now, running a Bitcoin full node. This is my central bank. And I'm meeting with all the other central bankers every 10 minutes. So that is truly fascinating. And yes, so far we have not changed the issuance rate. Well, let's see, maybe this will happen. Of course, with a consensus hard fork, you can change anything in the code, right? And that's why I do think that the Bitcoin Cash hard fork was such a contentious event, because it set the precedence of a hard fork. And if you set a precedence of the possibility of changing something, this can, of course, lead to a change of anything and everything. So do you think that, or how do you think that the unchangeability of Bitcoin's money supply can be treasured and kept?
So that is a good question. And I think part of that will come down to similarly the sort of campaigns that were ran in 2017, like the UASF campaign and the No2X campaign, campaigns by large holders and users who are running a node and do not agree with that particular hard fork. Now, as you might be aware, Max, there is a mandatory hard fork coming, and it's known as the year 2038 problem. However, I think from what I've seen by Luke-JR, I think he was saying we wouldn't actually need to, it's called the year 2038 problem, but it actually won't occur in Bitcoin until like 2100 or something. So we've got, a fair few decades to try and sort that particular hard fork out. But I think over time, Bitcoin's meme magic means that we are stuck with it's 21 million or bust. I think that is, it's almost formed, it's hardened around this culture of no inflation, or at least none beyond 21 million. And so I would like to think that's unchangeable. Now, it's possible, but I would say it's very, very, so vanishingly unlikely that, people that the whole network, the Schelling point were to change from, say, 21 million to 22 million. I don't see that happening. So yeah, I would say in short, I would say I think it's unlikely.
Yes, yes, I do agree. And I do think that this has to be treasured because this is one of Bitcoin's main selling calls is that it is unchangeable. Because just like gold is unchangeable, gold atoms, the consensus rules on what is defined as gold is the number of atoms, or sorry, the number of protons in the atoms, right?
Yeah.
And this cannot be changed. Of course, this is a physical law, but it cannot be changed, right? It's just impossible for us humans to go that deep into the physics yet and change it. And just like that, it has to be almost as equally hard to change Bitcoin, at least on the critical consensus aspects. But do you think that there will be, or how do you think that there will be changes implemented to improve the software, right? Because no software is ever free of bugs and no software is ever perfect. So there will have to be some changes. And where do you think can we draw the line here? Where is it okay to change Bitcoin to improve it? And where might a change be harmful?
Yeah, so I think some of the coming battles, from my point of view, may be around privacy and fungibility. Now, I don't know how deep you are into some of the technology around things like confidential transactions, and potentially, I think it varies based on what potential tech paths kind of Bitcoin takes, right? Like Taproot and Graftroot and some of these other technologies. Some of them may allow blinding of the transaction amount. However, they may also reduce our certainty over the full supply, that there is no inflation taking place if there were some kind of vulnerability or some kind of error, some kind of flaw in the cryptography. So there could be a coming battle around people who really, really want privacy in Bitcoin on the main chain, and the people who really, really want certainty over the 21 million, because they may say, hey, I don't want to take that risk of inflation. But then the privacy people might say, no, I really want privacy, right? So I don't know. We don't know where the, now I don't know the full details of it, right? So, happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on the technical part of that. But the way I think of it is that there will be, obviously the privacy and fungibility thing, it's a cat and mouse game. So there will always be kind of escalating. As there were efforts to do chain analysis, now there are efforts to break the heuristics that chain analysis people rely on, using things like CoinJoin and so on. And if you look at the work by NoPara73, Adam Fixel, or the Samurai Wallet guys, you can see that. But then there'll be an escalation there. It'll kind of keep moving. And then obviously with Lightning as well, there'll be improvements on privacy from that. But then there's a whole bunch of different considerations that we just haven't really gone into. So for example, with Lightning, now, yes, it's true that it uses the onion routing. Bolt 4 does that. However, if you don't do it over Tor, well, then people might be able to associate your IP address with certain UTXOs, right? So that's another angle. And then you've got the whole Dandelion angle as well, which is around transaction propagation on the main chain. So there's all these different privacy considerations. Who knows how it plays out? Now, the likely scenario that I would think is people just get to a point where it's kind of good enough. It's not necessarily like perfect, confidential, everything's perfect, but it's sort of just good enough, but with still good enough certainty on the 21 million. Because I think a lot of people would not be happy if they felt a greater sense of uncertainty around that 21 million cap. Yes. That's kind of that's my sort of key thoughts on it.
Yes, and that was something that really surprised me, is that that Bitcoin does not necessarily need to change the consensus rules on the base layer in order to improve privacy. Rather, you can use you can improve privacy on the wallet level. You can improve privacy on the network topology level. And even today, you can use Bitcoin quite anonymous, actually. if you are careful, if you do not reuse addresses, right? If you run your own full node and don't use SPV, if you run the full node over Tor, right? If you use the Dandelion project, there are already ways, and of course CoinJoin, right? There are already ways of using Bitcoin quite anonymous already, and it does not have to be on main consensus. So not everybody has to agree on these security features, but it's more simply, well, a soft fork would be technically the wrong term, but it can be compared to that it is a upgrade of the system that we do not have to reach a shelling point on. So that was really quite interesting, and the question then further is, if there is a compromise on the inflation target, or on the inflationary amount in Bitcoin due to an increase in privacy, will this fundamentally break Bitcoin, or do you think that Bitcoin could survive with the additional feature of more privacy, although with the lower certainty of economic stability?
I think this comes back to Pierre Rochard's node and Bitcoin governance discussion. So I think it really centers back around shelling points. So it is essentially the argument on the network would have to decide, right? I don't think they would coexist. I don't think we would have privacy Bitcoin on one side and 21 million, or certainty on 21 million Bitcoin on the other side. I think what will happen is the market will eventually make a call which one it prefers more. My sense is that the market will prefer the 21 million side a little bit more, and it will just take a slightly reduced privacy guarantees, let's call it. And over the long run, it might not matter so much with Lightning use, with various other techniques that you can do with hosted wallets. Maybe you'll have a trusted, you'll have some kind of hosted wallet, but you have some kind of multi-signature setup going, or maybe there's, increased use of channel factories. There's a lot of, there's just all these things that are way out in the future that we just don't know yet. So,
And there have already been countless black swan events, and there will be countless more, right? So, for example, Mimblewimble, that was a complete black swan event, is like out of the textbook, right? Random guy shows up on the internet, calls himself Voldemort, makes a mic drop, right? Makes this immense improvement to cryptography and to this network system, and leaves. And you just cannot ever comprehend the effects of such black swan events. And I do agree that there will be many improvements, not just with the stuff that we already know, like aggregated Schnorr or whatsoever, but with the stuff that we do not know yet that is going to come. And
exactly. Yeah. So I think I think there's not much you can really do about that. You just have to kind of keep an eye on things and see how they progress. That's the challenge as well. I think ultimately you just have to look at, what do the technical people think about that, and then also obviously analyze it from an economic point of view. So, for example, with Mimblewimble, I had a quick look into Grin, and it looks like they've got a constant 2% inflation. So monetarily very poor. So I think, Bitcoin's inflation is much, better than that, because we're kind of moving towards a fixed supply.
They do not have a fixed 2% inflation as far as I know, but they do have a fixed amount of Grin, I think is the name of the currency as well. So they issue a fixed amount of Grin every block, and this number does not decrease. But of course, because the stock will increase and the flow will stay the same, the stock to flow ratio will still increase after time, but it will never reach infinity as it does with Bitcoin, right? The flow of new currency into the stock will not go to zero ever, but the stock to flow ratio will increase. Now, again, I do not think that that's too bad. Yes, infinite stock to flow ratio would be better, but because it is ever increasing the stock to flow ratio, I do think that it is not too big of a hurdle.
Maybe, but I think that's only one part of it, you know? Then you've got all the other network effects as well. So obviously the wallets, the exchanges, the developers, all these other kind of things, and the fact that people have already bought, you know, Bitcoin and so on. So yeah, but it's possible. But yeah, I really don't know. But yeah, Max, can we start wrapping it up?
Oh yes, absolutely. So Stephan, we've talked for a lot now. Maybe a couple things that, or what do you think is important that we have not yet touched upon, just as an open exit question?
Oh, I wouldn't. No, I think we've kind of touched on a lot of the kind of money supply and Austrian economics components. I think, yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how it develops. That's really all I could say. I don't. Yeah, at this point, you know, things like ETFs and whatever, how whether we evolve into a free, like, because we're going to see that will see a bit of a test of the idea of whether we'll see free market fractional reserve banking, like the George Selgin, Larry White kind of free banking vision, or we'll see the full reserve vision, which I think is more likely, but I'm willing to be proven wrong on that. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, well we're all really excited and curious on how this all will work out, because well, we don't know, right? And that's the beautiful aspect of Bitcoin. So Stephan, I thank you very, very much for joining me here in this conversation, and I do hope that all the people in the chat watching, I really liked our conversation so far. If you guys would like to support the World Crypto Network and specifically my fund to raise here for a Purism laptop, you can donate Bitcoin right here. And if you want to support Stephan, he has here a paynim address in the Samurai wallet. So Stephan, just maybe for the people who do not know, what is this and how does it work?
Right. So yeah. Oh, cool. Thanks for bringing that up. It's a Samurai wallet feature, and basically what it does is it allows you, if you have a Samurai wallet as well, that you can scan that payment code and set up a payment, kind of like a payment channel, or like what it does. I don't know the technical explanation for it, but essentially it sets up a shared secret between the wallets, and it allows for more private transactions, because once you've set up the channel, then every other time it just automatically creates a new address. So it helps prevent address reuse, basically. So it adds to your privacy. It's basically the private way to take donations. So I thought I would fiddle around with it and try it, and you know, it's pretty cool. So
exactly, yeah. Right. So we've used it for each other, right? I've sent a few Satoshi through here, and it actually works quite well. But it is a on-chain transaction, right?
Yeah.
So
that's right.
And every time you scan this QR code, on the hierarchical deterministic tree of public addresses that are derived by the private key that is in Stephan's Samurai wallet, you basically get a arm or a branch of this tree of public addresses. And here you can generate a new address that all link to the same mnemonic seed, to the same root of private keys on Stephan's chain here. So again, you know, the Samurai wallet is amazing, and this is just one way how you can reuse addresses, because of course, right in here, right, the Tally coin that I'm using is always using the same Bitcoin address. So this, of course, you can now have this nice graph and see how much Bitcoin was sent to this fundraiser, but it, of course, breaks privacy. But as far as I know, DJ Booth, who's writing this software, he is thinking on how to implement a service that is similar to this paynim system from Samurai. Maybe he might even implement that. So let's see. I like the service so far from Tallycoin, but I do like paynim as well.
Excellent. Excellent.
So Stephan, again, thank you very much for joining us here. And again, the people can find you on Stephan Livera podcast, on YouTube and iTunes and whatsoever, on Twitter as well at Stephan Livera, and of course at stephanlivera.com.
Yep, that's right.
So,
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for having me on, Max. It's been a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure was all on my side. And there was a fantastic conversation, and I hope we'll have one in the future as well. So see you on the next show. Bye-bye.